So in 1505, Luther enters an Augustinian monastery in Germany. This action is a confirmation of a more than 1,000-year-old tradition of the priests withdrawing, the monks withdrawing from society to a monastery. Now, what Luther does is going to reverse this very ancient Roman Catholic Church institution. He will go into the monastery and he will come out and he will decide the monastic tradition is wrong. He will get married and enter the secular world as a leader of the Lutheran Church. So here you see in this simple act and his own evaluation a total reversal of the entire medieval Roman Catholic tradition. Luther and the Reformation are going to leave the monastery and come out into the world. The interesting thing about this in history is monasticism begins about the time of Augustine. So that's about 400. It's in the 300s, but pick off the year 400, easy to remember. So he's going into an Augustinian order, notice, all right? So here is Augustine, 400, and 1,100 years later, we have one of the most influential religious leaders ever in all of history going into the Augustinian order, and he will come out, and he will break with the monastic order, and he will break with the International Roman Catholic Church, and he will get married. So he is living in his personal life the thing that's happening in the church due to the Reformation. The then 1,100-year-old story, 1,200-year-old story of monasticism and celibacy was here at this moment in the person of Luther, entering into the Augustinian order, and soon he was going to leave it and get married. Isn't that fascinating? One of the things that this raises is the whole idea of the priesthood, the whole idea of what the church had expected. And it had definitely not had any of these ideas in the beginning. So in the very beginning, in the very first century, when we're talking Peter, Paul, and Rome, and the church is just slowly forming, nobody has a clear idea on how the leadership should live or what they should do or whether they should marry. Paul had his theories. People read those in his letters, but he said that was for him, that wasn't for everybody. And so it isn't until the late 300s that some church council finally says, well, we think all our priests should be single and celibate. So that's the decision, roughly 400, very, very close to 400. Now, in the Reformation, and in all the later critiques of the Roman Catholic Church, to this day, one of the number one items criticized is the celibate priesthood unmarried. That's one of the criticisms. So, for example, if you live in Italy and you deal with Italian Roman Catholics, they'll tell you that what they miss in their priestly leadership, all of whom they love and adore, so admire them, but what they miss is any knowledge of marriage. And they will come to the American or the English or some of the other foreign churches in the city, whether it's Florence or other, to consult with them when they have some kind of a crisis, whether it's to get married or to get unmarried or any number of things that happen with couples. They would ask, could they come and talk to the minister, whether it's American or other? Yes, of course you can. And then they would tell me later how wonderful it is to be able to talk to somebody in the church who knows about being married, knows something about marriage. So now, still, the issue is a big one. And it was one of the issues that led to the Reformation, because one of the very first things that all these leaders do once they've brought about the Reformation, Luther, Calvin, and everybody else, is they all got married. They got married, they had children, and they had families. So there's the beginning of one fascinating subject. So Luther is now in the order, devotes himself to prayer and to fasting. He goes on pilgrimages. And he says, in retrospect, it was a terrible period of despair. I lost touch with Christ and made him my jailer and hangman. And what he meant was, no matter how much he prayed and no matter how many good things he tried to do, it was never enough to assuage his personal conscience. He was always feeling that he was short. Then this man, von Staupitz, came to the Augustinian order and visited and got to know him, and it's Staupitz who, he says, saves his soul, saves him in advising him what was wrong in his thinking. And then the great thing that happened was Staupitz became the dean of the new University of Wittenberg. The Duke of Saxony, who presided over this area and wanted to set up a new university of Wittenberg, asked this fine Augustinian man to run it for him, and so that's what he did. And so Staupitz calls Luther to come there and be a professor of theology. Of course, you could be a professor as well as an Augustinian monk, and so he's going to be professor at that university. He is officially professor of theology, but he's certainly not going to be limited to theology. Here's Wittenberg, a beautiful small city you can see on our map over there on the east edge of the red area. So just south of Berlin, very close to Leipzig and Dresden. Many different things here tied to Luther, including the great church, the University Church, which is, of course, the scene of the great Reformation itself. Here are pictures of the city. And at the university, he is a brilliant professor. The students love him. All of this is protected, presided over, endowed by the wonderful Duke Frederick, who is a lector of Saxony. So in addition to being the Duke of Saxony, he's also one of the 7 electors of the Holy Roman Emperor. And you all know all about the Holy Roman Empire here in the class. You've been on this subject here. We're in week 13, so you know about it. And so this man had unusual power as one of the 7 who elect the next Holy Roman Emperor. So he is the Duke from 1486 to his death, and patron of the university, good friend of Luther. And I have some outtakes from the great Luther movie. If you've never seen the movie Luther, go look for it. It's on Prime, so you can rent it for $3. And if you've never seen it, go see it. It's spectacular. But in the movie, it is the great Peter Ustinov playing the Duke in one of the best performances of his life. It was his last major role. So it's that Duke who's protecting all of this. And in the Holy Roman Empire, as you know, there's a map, these individual dukes had a lot of power. And particularly if they're an elector, if they're one of the 7 who get to choose the next emperor, so he's very important. So Luther's lecturing in the university on lots of medieval subjects like Aristotle and Cicero and others. He goes to Rome as a member of the Augustinian order and finds Rome. Here's what's being painted when he goes there. Isn't that fascinating to think Luther's in Rome when Raphael is painting the School of Athens? I think it's quite wonderful. And Michelangelo is in the other room painting the Sistine. All this is going on. He hates Rome, hates the corruption in the church, comments on the priests, how terrible they are. They mumble through the Mass. You can't even understand what they're saying. They just mush, mumble through it. They pee in the streets. He found this disgusting. They have whores, they have prostitutes, all sorts of things. He came back to Germany just overcome with the experience of corruption in Rome, and he came back to begin lecturing on the Paul's letter to the Romans, and it is the key piece, the intellectual piece, the swing, the change, that is going to bring about the Reformation. So when I say this is an idea, I mean really an idea. He's a professor of theology. He's lecturing on the fine points of Paul and Christianity, and he takes the letter to the Romans as his text, and he's going to go through it step by step by step. And what he finds in it is this concept of the justice of God and his inability to understand it. I greatly long to understand Paul's letter, and nothing stood in my way except the phrase, the justice of God, because I took it to mean the justice whereby God deals out and punishes the sinner. So in other words, he was thinking of it legally. He was thinking of the justice of God in this letter from Paul legally, that that God was sitting up there and he was the big judge, and he was sending a lot of people to hell and a lot of people to heaven. And for him, he said, my situation was, although I was an impeccable monk, I felt I stood before God as a sinner troubled in my conscience. In other words, I had done everything right. I was never mean. I never mistreated anybody. I never stole anything. And I still didn't think I was close to being worthy of being saved. So he didn't like this whole idea, the justice of God. So night and day I pondered until I saw once the connection between justice of God and the just shall live by faith. That was his breakthrough. That it didn't really mean justice of God like law, like judges sitting up on the benches. It meant that we would be just and made just, and we would be saved by our faith. And that was the breakthrough. That was the great, great, great breakthrough. It was the breakthrough to the Reformation, to the intellectual revolution of 1500, all the other ideas that were great revolutions of the very same or similar close time moment. Take Columbus. Take Columbus. Columbus is also an intellectual revolution. It's not just this Italian guy getting in a bunch of boats with some other guys and going across, but it's the intellectual preparation of Columbus through decades of reading maps, and then his ability to get a printed copy from Rome, 1480, so very early in the printing revolution, a printed copy of Ptolemy. He gets he buys a copy in Portugal of the printed copy of Ptolemy, the long ago Greek scientist in Alexandria who writes the definitive book on latitude and longitude and the circumference of the earth, and of course all the information you need to think about the globe as a circle. So Columbus gets that book off the printing press in Rome, which exists because of Gutenberg in Germany, and he takes that book and he reads that book and he comes to understand the mathematical structure of the globe that we live in. He came to understand the abstract system of the globe, and to understand that he could get in a boat in Spain, go west, and turn around and end up coming east. So he was right, but it's an intellectual revolution before he ever gets in the boat. Understand? Everybody understand? It's an intellectual revolution inside the mind of Columbus. And how does this come about? A book printed in Rome with a press invented by Gutenberg in Germany. How do you like that? Now, where'd they get the book? Well, they got it from Florence. Well, how'd the book get to Florence? It was written in Egypt, in Alexandria. How'd it get to Florence? Well, it went all the way through. Went to Constantinople in Greek, and it was carried to Florence in 1400 by Manuel Chrysoloras. Remember him? Remember our wonderful friend Manuel Chrysoloras? And he comes to Florence. Why? Why does he come to Florence in 1400? Because the city hires him to teach Greek. Comes to Florence in 1400 to teach Greek. And brings with him this book and gives it to the Florentines. And one of the Florentines runs off and translates it into Latin, because that's what they can all read. And it's that one that Columbus carries with him. Now, how do you like that? The guy in Alexandria in the first century writes a book, it's carried to Constantinople, sits there for 1400 years, carried to Florence in 1400, translated by a Florentine who knows both Greek and Latin, and printed in Rome and shipped to Portugal and sold in Portugal to a guy who was studying maps and things. And that guy goes to Spain and gets money for a trip from the king and queen of Spain. And what does he have on his boat when he makes his trip? His Ptolemy. He has his book of Ptolemy in his boat, which explains latitude and longitude, and that's how he figures it out. How do you like that? That's just an idea. It's an idea in a head, and it changes the world forever and ever and ever and ever.